The television studio lights blazed as Chris Wallace sat across from Representative Jasmine Crockett, the atmosphere charged with tension that even viewers at home could feel through their screens. What had been advertised as a routine Sunday interview on national policy was clearly about to veer into unexpected territory. "Before we discuss the infrastructure bill," Wallace began, his voice carrying the measured tone that had made him one of television's most respected interviewers, "I want to address your comments last Tuesday about police funding that have created quite a stir across both sides of the aisle." The cameras caught Crockett's expression, composed but alert, her posture straightening almost imperceptibly as Wallace continued. "You stated that redirecting police funds to community services was the only rational approach to public safety in America today. Not a rational approach, but the only rational approach," Wallace emphasized, leaning forward. "Are you suggesting that anyone who disagrees with your position, including the 64% of Americans who support maintaining or increasing police funding according to the latest Gallup poll, are all irrational?" Wallace's question hung in the air as he removed his glasses, a signature move viewers recognized as his preparation for a challenging exchange. It seems remarkably dismissive of legitimate concerns about rising crime rates in cities that have reduced police budgets. The studio fell silent as Wallace continued his methodical critique. "Furthermore, you claim statistics show a clear correlation between reduced police presence and improved community safety, yet the Department of Justice data I have here directly contradicts that assertion." He held up a folder of papers, tapping it firmly. "Would you like to explain this discrepancy to our viewers?" The camera panned to Crockett, who remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Wallace. The veteran journalist clearly expected a defensive response or hasty retreat from his pointed challenge. Instead, Crockett smiled slightly, not the uncomfortable smile of someone backed into a corner, but the confident expression of someone who had anticipated this trap and come fully prepared to dismantle it. What followed would not only stun Wallace into momentary silence, but would become one of the most watched political exchanges of the year. If you're finding this political showdown interesting, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hard-hitting political analysis. Now let's see how Representative Crockett responds to this challenge. Representative Jasmine Crockett had not risen to national prominence by accident or through traditional political channels. At 41, the Texas Democrat had forged her reputation through a combination of intellectual rigor and unwavering principle that even her opponents grudgingly respected. Before entering Congress, Crockett had distinguished herself as a criminal justice attorney with over 100 successful cases defending clients against excessive force charges. Her legal background included a prestigious clerkship with a conservative-leaning federal judge, an experience she often credited with teaching her to argue persuasively across ideological divides. After winning a state legislative seat in a district that had been Republican for decades, she quickly established herself as someone who prioritized data-driven policies over partisan talking points. "I didn't come to politics to make friends or follow party lines," she had told her constituents during her congressional campaign. "I came because the problems we face demand solutions based on facts, not fear." This approach had earned her both intense loyalty from supporters and significant criticism from traditional political forces accustomed to more predictable positioning. A viral moment during a Judiciary Committee hearing, where she methodically deconstructed a witness's testimony using their own contradictory statements, had catapulted her into the national spotlight 6 months earlier. Chris Wallace, meanwhile, represented the old guard of broadcast journalism. At 75, his 5-decade career had included interviews with every president since Nixon. Known for his equal opportunity challenging of politicians from both parties, Wallace had earned a reputation as television's most prepared interviewer, famous for his exhaustive research and refusal to accept evasive answers. The son of legendary journalist Mike Wallace, he had worked diligently to establish his own legacy while carrying forward his father's commitment to substantive questioning. His trademark approach involved presenting seemingly irrefutable evidence that contradicted his subject's position, then watching them attempt to reconcile the discrepancy. The most revealing moment in any interview, Wallace once explained to journalism students, is not when someone gives a prepared answer, but when they're confronted with information that challenges their established narrative. The conflict between them centered on Crockett's recent speech advocating for a controversial approach to public safety funding that had ignited fierce debate. While popular among progressives, her proposal had drawn criticism from moderate Democrats worried about election implications, and Republicans who labeled it dangerous and extreme. In the gallery of the studio sat retired police chief Thomas Rodriguez, who had implemented a similar program in his mid-sized city with notable success, though it had received little national attention. Beside him sat community organizer Keisha Williams, whose organization had documented the human impact of traditional policing models in underserved neighborhoods. For Wallace, the stakes were professional. After several high-profile interviews where subjects had successfully evaded his questions with rehearsed talking points, network executives had made it clear they expected this exchange to generate headlines and social media engagement. For Crockett, the stakes were both political and moral. Her position had been deliberately mischaracterized by opponents, and this interview represented an opportunity to clarify her evidence-based approach while demonstrating she could withstand the toughest questioning from a journalistic heavyweight. What are your thoughts on media confrontations like this? Have you noticed how prepared politicians often are for gotcha moments? Share your experiences with politically charged interviews in the comments below. We'd love to hear which memorable exchanges have shaped your views on political discourse. Thank you for that question, Mr. Wallace, Crockett began, her voice measured and clear, a stark contrast to the tension that had built. Before I address your specific concerns, I'd like to correct a fundamental misrepresentation of my statement. Wallace's eyebrow raised slightly, his expression suggesting he hadn't expected this approach. What I actually said, and I have the transcript here, Crockett continued, retrieving a document from her portfolio, was that reallocating appropriate portions of police funding towards specialized community services represents the only rational approach to comprehensively addressing public safety challenges in America today. She placed the transcript on the table between them. You'll notice the qualifiers appropriate portions and comprehensively addressing were omitted from your characterization of my statement. These distinctions matter significantly. Wallace glanced at the transcript, his expression flickering briefly with recognition that the quote had indeed been truncated. Before he could respond, Crockett continued. As for the Gallup poll you referenced, I'm familiar with it, she said, pulling out her own document. What's interesting is that when that same poll asked more specific questions about redirecting funds to mental health services, community-based violence prevention, and social workers responding to certain calls, support jumped to 76%. People support maintaining effective policing while also funding specialized responses for situations where armed officers aren't the optimal solution. The studio remained silent as Crockett methodically addressed Wallace's challenges one by one. Rather than becoming defensive, she appeared completely in her element. Now, regarding your assertion about Department of Justice data contradicting my statement on correlations between revised funding models and community safety, she continued, her tone becoming more animated as she reached into her portfolio again. I believe you're referring to the preliminary 2023 report that looked at raw crime statistics without contextual analysis. Wallace's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not the flustered response he had anticipated. What's particularly relevant, Crockett said as she placed 3 more documents on the table, is the comprehensive follow-up study released just last month that examined outcomes in the 12 cities that implemented the exact model I'm proposing. She slid the report toward Wallace. This analysis found a 23% reduction in violent crime incidents, a 31% improvement in response times for emergency situations, and a 46% decrease in use of force complaints. Wallace reached for the report, scanning it quickly as Crockett continued. But statistics only tell part of the story, Mr. Wallace, she said, her voice taking on a more personal tone. Behind these numbers are real communities experiencing real improvements in safety and police-community relations. She removed a photograph from her portfolio, a community gathering showing police officers and residents working together on a neighborhood project. This is from Camden, New Jersey, where they completely restructured their approach to public safety with results so successful that former critics now point to it as a model. Wallace, visibly recalibrating his approach, interjected, "Representative Crockett, while these examples are compelling, they represent specific communities with unique circumstances. Do you really believe this one-size-fits-all approach?" "I've never advocated for a one-size-fits-all approach," Crockett interrupted firmly but respectfully. "In fact, in my full statement, which I notice wasn't included in your research materials, I specifically emphasized the need for customized implementation based on community needs and existing resources." She reached for yet another document. "What I find particularly interesting is that several police chiefs from mid-sized cities have endorsed variations of this model, including Chief Rodriguez, who is actually here in the studio today." The camera panned briefly to Rodriguez, whose presence clearly surprised Wallace. His department saw a 28% reduction in officer injuries alongside improved safety outcomes after implementing a similar program. Wallace, recognizing that his initial line of questioning had been effectively countered, shifted tactics. "Let's talk about political realities, Representative. Your colleagues on both sides of the aisle have criticized this position as politically untenable. Even members of your own party have suggested it hands Republicans a powerful talking point for the midterms. Are you putting your principles ahead of practical political considerations?" It was a classic Wallace pivot. When factual challenges failed, question the political wisdom. Crockett smiled slightly. "Mr. Wallace, I've always believed that good policy eventually becomes good politics. When we implemented a similar approach in my state legislative district, which, as you know, had historically voted Republican, initial resistance was strong. 6 months later, when residents experienced improved emergency response times and saw police officers able to focus on serious crimes rather than responding to mental health crises, approval ratings for the program crossed 70%. She leaned forward slightly. "The truth is, Americans aren't nearly as wedded to outdated models as political consultants seem to think they are. What they want are approaches that actually work, regardless of which ideological box they fit into." The studio had grown increasingly quiet as staff members stopped their usual behind-the-scenes activities to watch the exchange unfold. Even Wallace's producer, visible at the edge of the set, appeared captivated by the conversation that had evolved far beyond the expected confrontation. Wallace, recognizing the need to reassert control of the interview, tried another approach. "Your critics suggest that your academic approach ignores the real-world experiences of officers on the street. How do you respond to law enforcement officials who say your proposals endanger their officers?" "I'm glad you raised that concern," Crockett replied, seeming genuinely pleased with the question, "because it allows me to address a fundamental misconception. My proposals are actually based on direct input from law enforcement professionals who have identified situations where armed response is unnecessary and potentially escalatory." She produced a letter signed by multiple police union representatives. "These officers have explicitly stated that being tasked with responding to nonviolent mental health crises, homelessness issues, and domestic disputes without proper support puts them in impossible situations. They want the appropriate resources and partnerships to handle these challenges effectively." Wallace, now visibly reassessing the dynamic of the interview, glanced down at his notes. The exchange had veered dramatically from his planned trajectory. He had expected to corner Crockett with statistics and political realities, but instead found himself facing a methodically prepared opponent who had anticipated his strategy and brought receipts for every point. "Let me be clear," Crockett continued, her voice firm but not combative. "This isn't about defunding anything. It's about funding the right resources for the right situations. It's about ensuring that when someone calls 911 with a mental health crisis, the response doesn't escalate to tragedy simply because we sent only armed officers without specialized support." She paused, making direct eye contact with Wallace. "And frankly, Mr. Wallace, I'm disappointed that someone with your journalistic integrity would begin this discussion with a mischaracterization of my position rather than engaging with what I've actually proposed. The studio fell completely silent. No one challenged Chris Wallace on his own show. It simply wasn't done. The camera caught Wallace's expression, a mixture of surprise and what appeared to be a reluctant glimmer of professional respect. "That's a fair criticism," Wallace acknowledged after a moment, something viewers rarely heard from the veteran journalist. "So let's address what you're actually proposing. Walk me through how this would work in practice." With this simple pivot, what had begun as an attempted gotcha moment transformed into a substantive policy discussion that would captivate viewers and generate entirely different headlines than Wallace had anticipated. What happened next fundamentally altered the trajectory of the interview and would later be analyzed in journalism schools across the country. Rather than continuing to fence with Wallace, Crockett seized the opening he had provided. "I appreciate your willingness to engage with the substance of these proposals, Mr. Wallace," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to collaborative. "Let me start with a concrete example that illustrates exactly how this approach works in practice." She proceeded to outline a detailed case study from Dallas, where specialized crisis intervention teams had successfully de-escalated a potentially volatile situation involving a veteran experiencing PTSD. The story was compelling not just for its positive outcome, but for how it demonstrated clear benefits for all involved. The individual received appropriate care, community members remained safe, and police resources weren't tied up in a situation better handled by mental health professionals. Wallace, now genuinely engaged rather than simply looking for weaknesses to exploit, asked thoughtful follow-up questions about implementation challenges and funding mechanisms. As Crockett provided clear, evidence-based responses, the dynamic in the studio visibly shifted. "What's often lost in the political rhetoric around these issues," Crockett explained, "is that these approaches have been successfully implemented in both progressive urban centers and conservative rural communities. The common denominator isn't political ideology. It's a willingness to follow evidence rather than emotion." Wallace nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was processing this perspective. Yet the messaging around these initiatives has often been politically charged, making it difficult to build consensus. "That's precisely why I've been working with a bipartisan coalition to reframe the conversation," Crockett replied, revealing information that clearly surprised Wallace. "In fact, we've just secured support from 3 Republican senators for a pilot program based on these principles." The revelation landed like a bombshell. Wallace, momentarily caught off guard, adjusted his glasses, a tell viewers recognized as his reaction to unexpected information. "You're saying you have Republican support for this initiative? That hasn't been reported anywhere," Wallace said, his journalistic instincts clearly engaged. "The formal announcement is scheduled for next week," Crockett confirmed with a slight smile. "But I'm glad to share it here first. These senators recognize that improving public safety while reducing unnecessary confrontations is neither a Democratic nor Republican issue. It's just good governance." Wallace set down his notes, a rare mid-interview concession that his prepared questions had been rendered irrelevant by this new information. "That's a significant development, Representative Crockett. Why do you think these Republican colleagues have come on board when the public discourse has been so polarized?" "Because they've seen the data and spoken directly with law enforcement leaders who support these reforms," Crockett explained. "When we move past the inflammatory rhetoric and focus on outcomes, these approaches make sense across the political spectrum." She paused, then delivered what would become the most quoted line from the interview. "The greatest threat to effective policy isn't partisan disagreement, Mr. Wallace. It's our reluctance to abandon approaches that don't work simply because they're familiar." The studio remained silent as the weight of the exchange settled. Wallace's producer could be seen in the peripheral shot, signaling that the segment had already run longer than scheduled, but Wallace waved him off, a clear indication that he recognized the journalistic value of what was unfolding. "Representative Crockett," Wallace said finally, his tone notably different from the confrontational approach he'd begun with, "you've presented a compelling case for reimagining certain aspects of public safety response. But I have to ask, why hasn't your message broken through the political noise before today? It was a softball question from a journalist famous for throwing curveballs, an implicit acknowledgement that the interview had evolved from an attempted takedown to a genuine exploration of policy innovation. Media framing plays a powerful role, Mr. Wallace, Crockett replied with a knowing smile. When complex policies are reduced to misleading sound bites, like suggesting I want to eliminate police funding when I've consistently advocated for optimizing public safety resources, it's difficult for nuanced approaches to break through. She maintained eye contact with Wallace as she continued. That's why conversations like this one, where we move past gotcha moments to substantive discussion, are so valuable. I hope other media figures will follow your example of being willing to engage with the actual proposals rather than simplified caricatures. It was a masterful response, simultaneously complimenting Wallace for a pivot he had been forced to make while subtly highlighting how the interview had begun with exactly the type of mischaracterization she was critiquing. The cameras caught Wallace's expression, a mixture of professional appreciation for the skilled response and the realization that he had been outmaneuvered by a politician who had come extraordinarily well prepared for his trademark tactics. "Well, Representative Crockett," Wallace said, a slight smile suggesting his recognition of what had transpired, "I think our viewers have certainly benefited from this more substantive exploration. We'll be watching next week's announcement with great interest." As the segment concluded, the studio erupted in conversation. Staff members who typically maintained professional detachment during interviews were animatedly discussing what they had witnessed. In the control room, producers were already planning how to promote clips from what had clearly become a breakout moment. The impact of the interview was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, clips of the exchange had gone viral across social media platforms, with particular focus on the moment when Crockett produced the full transcript of her statement, effectively countering Wallace's initial framing. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary," noted media analyst Regina Martinez on an evening news program. "Chris Wallace has built a career on catching politicians in contradictions or forcing them to address uncomfortable facts. Today, Representative Crockett essentially beat him at his own game, but did so in a way that elevated the discussion rather than simply scoring political points." Conservative commentator Michael Brooks, typically critical of Democratic policies, offered surprising praise. "Regardless of whether you agree with her proposals, Crockett demonstrated how to effectively communicate complex policy positions. She came with evidence, anticipated counterarguments, and redirected a hostile interview into a productive conversation. That's a masterclass in political communication." By the following morning, the major networks were analyzing not just the content of the exchange, but its potential impact on how public safety reforms were discussed in mainstream media. The phrase "appropriate portions" began trending as commentators noted how selective quotation had initially misrepresented Crockett's position. For Wallace, the interview prompted both professional reflection and unexpected opportunities. Initially, some viewers expected him to be defensive about how the exchange had unfolded. Instead, in a move that enhanced his reputation for journalistic integrity, he opened his next broadcast with a candid acknowledgement. "Last week's interview with Representative Crockett generated significant discussion, and rightfully so," Wallace told viewers. "While I began our conversation with what I believed was a fair characterization of the representative's position, she effectively demonstrated that context matters. As journalists, we have a responsibility to engage with the substance of policy proposals, not just the simplified versions that make for easy political narratives." This acknowledgement earned Wallace praise from journalism ethicists and demonstrated why he remained respected across the political spectrum despite occasional missteps. Rather than doubling down, he had modeled how to respond when confronted with evidence that challenged his framing. For Crockett, the aftermath brought both opportunity and increased scrutiny. Requests for interviews flooded her office, and several police associations reached out to discuss her proposals in greater detail. The bipartisan announcement the following week received significantly more coverage than would have occurred before her appearance on Wallace's program. "What Representative Crockett achieved wasn't just a political win," observed Dr. Elaine Harper, a professor of political communication. She fundamentally shifted how media outlets discuss these policy proposals. By refusing to accept a simplified characterization and methodically presenting evidence, she created space for nuance in a conversation that had been dominated by binary thinking. Perhaps most significantly, several cities announced pilot programs based on the principles Crockett had outlined, with local officials specifically citing the interview as having clarified misconceptions about how such approaches would work in practice. The most unexpected consequence came 2 months later, when Chris Wallace invited Crockett to participate in a special roundtable discussion on evidence-based policy approaches. The format allowed for detailed exploration of complex issues without the confrontational framework of traditional interviews. "Today we're trying something different," Wallace told viewers. "Instead of the rapid-fire exchanges that characterize most political programs, we're creating space for thorough examination of policy approaches that don't fit neatly into partisan boxes." It represented a small but meaningful shift in how policy discussions were conducted on mainstream platforms, a shift that many traced directly back to that pivotal interview. For media scholars, the exchange became a case study in how prepared politicians could redirect hostile interviews by combining thorough preparation with respectful but firm correction of mischaracterizations. For policy advocates, it demonstrated how evidence-based approaches could transcend partisan divides when properly explained and contextualized. 6 months later, preliminary data from the pilot programs showed promising results, validating many of Crockett's core arguments. In a follow-up interview, this time with a very different tone from their first encounter, Wallace asked what she considered the most important lesson from the entire experience. "It's simple," Crockett replied. "When we move past simplistic framings and engage honestly with complex challenges, we often discover that apparent political divisions are less about fundamental values and more about incomplete information. Most Americans want the same outcomes: safe communities, efficient use of resources, and approaches that work. Our job as leaders is to cut through the noise and focus on delivering those results." The exchange between Crockett and Wallace hadn't just made for compelling television. It had demonstrated that even in an era of heightened polarization, substantive policy discussions could break through when participants came armed with facts rather than talking points. As political communication evolved, the interview remained a touchstone example of how preparation, evidence, and principled persistence could transform a potential ambush into an opportunity for genuine understanding. This story reminds us that in political discourse, substance ultimately matters more than style, and that being thoroughly prepared can turn even the most challenging confrontations into opportunities for positive change. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth examinations of pivotal political moments. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming series on how effective communication can bridge partisan divides in an increasingly polarized landscape. Your support helps us continue providing thoughtful analysis beyond the headlines.